Hey everyone, thanks and welcome for joining. I'm going to start a different spot than my first false start. So my name is Rob Beeler. I see a number of people I don't know. Thanks for joining in on this particular webcast, this discussion. As you can see, I set it up as a meeting. That means, sure, keep your mics muted, but when it's time for a question, go ahead and turn on. Let me know if you're going to be asking a question, just to keep our kind of flow together. And at the same time, this is a small enough group that there's no reason we don't crowdsource some of these conversations and topics. I mean, obviously, a lot of this is going to be driven by conversation with Rob. To give you an idea of who I am and why I do this, so Rob Beeler, most people know me from my ad monsters and everything I've done on that front for now 11 plus years. But as Beeler.Tech, I like to create additional content and conversations I'm not hearing elsewhere. And what kind of drew me to this was Rob's article, where it wasn't just, gee, how do you lead through a pandemic, but like, how do you lead through survival mode? And I thought that like cut through a lot of the positioning that so many people take on. And I've known Rob, Rob, I'm even trying to think of when we met. I think it was ads.com day. I mean, it was back
New
then.
Orleans. I think wasn't it New Orleans Ad Monsters with the we dug out all the lead, that lead infected soil.
Yes. That's how you and I. This is why this is like the Bob Hope, Bing Crosby show, because like I don't lead with that New Orleans experience with the lead part of it. But yes, we were going into people's backyards and cleaning it up, and who knows what things we were handling, with our bare hands. Okay,
yes.
So that's we were helping the community. But thanks, Rob, for that. See, that's why I want to talk to Rob about this stuff, because, and I put a link to his article in here. And again, all I'll do is set the stage of Rob. I want to kind of hear what you're up to, but like the idea here is just kind of explore this particular direction. So Rob, we met a while ago, but I'd love to hear what you've been up to, what you're focused on, and so forth, so people know why you're here.
Sure. So thanks, Rob, and thanks for everybody joining. I've been in the performance digital marketing space since late 2000. Been in a number of different types of companies. So if everyone's familiar with the LumaScape and all the little kind of yellow boxes on the LumaScape, I've had senior leadership roles in many of the major boxes on the scape itself. So very good understanding of how everything flows all the way through. And I think, and I always say it is, when a financial or Wall Street analyst looks at the RTB ad space or programmatic ad space, they tend to assume it's like regular economics, right? Where everything's rational. And the reality is, if you've been in this space, it's like Dan Ariely's like behavioral economics, like, the stuff doesn't necessarily make sense, but it does make sense if you actually understand the motivations and how people are getting paid and how everything kind of works, whether it's actually the people processes or the actual technology talking to each other. Fast forward, late last year, or September last year, I took over as new CEO of Eyeview Digital, which was a performance video solution. We just recapped the company, and I had come in to kind of take it from the recap state and grow it. And we were doing great from a revenue perspective, but as I said to the team, and it was kind of a incredible story, but literally on my, I think 90th, 100th day, I had to tell all 85 people that they were going to lose their jobs at the end of the year. Probably one of the most awful days of my career and top worst day. But I will say, amazing team there. They were doing, but yeah, so now I'm basically have a back to consulting, and prior I had a consulting practice after Rubicon, very focused on ad tech, performance marketing, and everything around strategy, operational excellence, data driven decision making, and these are all kinds of techniques that I've used over my my long career now. I'm realizing I've been doing this for a long time, but the key thing. I think it was the second week I was there. We went on an offsite with the executive team, and we kind of reprioritized the product roadmap, because that's one of the things I find in ad tech. It's really tough because you have, and I'm sure this goes outside of ad tech as well, but you get one thing that works really well. You do those, one or two things really, really well. And then all of a sudden, sometimes organizations will think they can do 20 things at once really, really well. And that kind of exponential growth of focus, things you're working on, and then all of a sudden, everything kind of grinds to a halt, right? So product delivery slows down, revenue eventually slows down, all these kind of bad things occur. So when we went back to the roadmap, I had kind of a certain lens that I use. And, now that I've wound down the company and thankfully I think almost every employee got a job,
That's great.
at least that wanted a job by, end of January, which was great considering the timing. But I said, hey, let me put this down into writing how I'd be thinking about this if I was leading the company at that moment in time. But the same lens we used because we had a certain amount of cash and we had to stay focused. And at the end of the day, it's like all these techniques that they're applicable whether you're in or not. I would just say you might adjust the volume of each of them as time goes on.
Got it. Well, no, and thank you for that, Robin. So, and one thing I'm going to suggest that you and I do is break up our, I'm going to have you go on long periods of time, just because I can tell the video quality cuts out after a little bit on your connection.
Okay.
So, but thanks for that, right? Because I think that you even just kind of hit an underlying theme there of when you're operating just as normal, right? There's a tendency to just continually just grow in terms of all these other things you can do. 2020, is its own year here. You're great at these analogies, and we're going to touch on some of them. You're going to have to actually explain some of them to me, Rob, and your fascination with the Yakuza as well. But I'll give you my reference is the Kobayashi Maru scenario in Star Trek. How do you get through 2020? Are you supposed to? It doesn't, it's not a easy scenario to necessarily win, but that's where I liked, again, where you kind of broke it down into survival, mode of thinking about this and cutting things to the core and doing it well. And so you broke it into three parts, right? And one was around, mindset. The next was recategorizing and getting your roadmap, and then order of impact. And so I kind of wanted to follow that same kind of theme to it. And I put the link in the chat for anyone that has not read the article. So you start with, remind everyone that if you make, their job or task go away, that you're going to help them find a new job or task. And it sounded like you did that for your prior company. That seems to be something where that's a moment put upon you, or true recognition of where the company is when you start to have to get there, right? Is there, talk a little bit about that, right?
Yes and no. So my normal way of saying that, and I didn't write it in the article because it's too easily taken out of context. And plus we're also in, COVID and people are losing their jobs. But my normal statement is, and I'll say this in all hands, and I see Alex R is there and he'll vouch for me, is, I want, if you make your job go away or task go away, I will find you a new job. If I make your job go away, that may or may not be bad. And I, and you say it but the reality is that because these companies grow so quickly, a lot of manual things pop up and we do things in totally suboptimal ways. And then you also combine that with the fact that a lot of companies don't have really good onboarding, really good training. Managers, for the most part, are not really that well trained classically anymore, right? So we have all these things. Then if you think of the employees, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Is do you know what your job is, or do you know if you're doing a good job at it? Is pretty important, right? And then the next step would be do I have a career path? How do I get to the next step? Is that clear? Obviously believing in the company should probably be on there somewhere, and its mission. So because you've got this situation where some of those things may not be in an optimal state, people are nervous that if they do make their job go away, they know a lot of people know they're doing stuff that's highly repetitive. They're like, oh man, I can't believe I'm doing this. Right. But they just do it because they're like, if I raise my hand and say this is dumb, I shouldn't do this, or we can automate it, they're afraid they'll get fired, or who knows. Because you have to, if the managers and the leadership of the company aren't repetitively saying look, operating leverage, right? You want to drive operating leverage. So if like half of your job can be automated, let's automate it, because I've probably got a list of 100 more things that are more higher
Right.
value activities that I could put you on.
And I think that's one thing, right, for employees to understand, is that going and hiring someone new is harder than it is to take someone that knows the company, knows some of the culture, in fact, has been doing a task, that if you can automate that, there's the next level of, hey, now that we have this automated, we can do more, right? And
Yes.
that's, and again, that takes trust, right? Takes trust that they're you operate that way. Um, you may not have at this time in 2020 the ability to demonstrate that over time anymore,
Sure.
but I think that there's an aspect of, like, I think people, I mean, that's one thing I would also throw to that, is your frankness with the company, like how you talk in an all, again, I'm putting you into a scenario here,
Sure.
right? But that scenario is, if you're managing a company right now in 2020, you're looking at the financials, you're looking at where you are. There's not investment coming to save you, right? How direct are you talking to the team all the way up? What is that conversation? Are you cheerleading? Are you, here, I'm going to draw numbers and they're going to be in the red? How do you do it?
Yeah. I mean, so I think you have to adjust the message based on the audience, right? So I think when you're, as CEO to the direct reports, like there's gonna be a certain level of transparency in the C-suite upper level that may not be down to the lower level, because the reality is, like, I don't necessarily want to burden everybody with facts or data or potential outcomes that they can't directly affect, right? Because that can just create more craziness, right? So like my key focus is like, hey, let's focus on, important KPIs of the business. Hey, if it's in the red, it's in the red, right? Like, I think sometimes people think that, companies are like, it's like the CIA and all the data is compartmentalized and nobody knows anything. Like, I would venture a guess that like 99% of the people on this call would say, yeah, when something really bad is happening in the company, everybody knows already. So when you say, okay, like, we're not gonna, put up that the numbers are in the red and we need to turn them around because we're afraid that people might find out that we're in the red, like, that stuff will trickle out naturally. So you have to kind of, I just kind of embrace it. Now, you don't have to go into the, crazy level of detail where it doesn't work for the majority of people, or they can't digest it. But I do believe in that, like, radical transparency. And that's why, almost every place I've been at since advertising.com, we set up a daily war room, which is literally like looking at the numbers yesterday versus the day ago versus 7 days ago. And it's always tracking towards a goal. So, that kind of transparency, like, sure, it does get, it weighs on you. Like, when you are behind goal and you just see tracking behind goal, it stinks, right? Like, it's terrible. But what's the other option? We just pretend that we're not behind goal and we don't act like our hair's on fire to, like, try to close the gap. Like,
Right.
I'm not sure that's a good outcome either.
So just as a quick reminder, again, with this size of a group, that if there's other thoughts and comments people want to make, love to add that to it. But Rob to me is like a wealth of information, so I'm just going to keep going to him until someone else wants to weigh in. There's a part to that, though. I think that's right. That, like, you certainly want to have someone that can affect the overall outcome weighed down with, like, somehow you're asking them to help save the company. But I do think what is interesting in what you said, and again, this is why I love to elaborate on the article, is this idea of getting people's ideas out on the table and get that flow going, even if it means automating my job, right?
Yes.
Or thinking about those particular things. I would say that and as someone who does this kind of thing all the time, you can imagine sometimes I have to coax people into talking and coax people into interacting. We'll probably do it. Rob, how do you get some of these ideas? Like, I guess I feel like there's anything in terms of tips or tricks that you use to get people to truly share, hey, there's a big aspect of my job I don't need to be doing, if we could solve for that.
Yeah. So, couple ways of doing that, right? So normally when I onboard at a company, I will interview every single person that's in my org, right? So, at Eyeview, I interviewed everybody in the company. for 30 minutes, and I ask a standard set of questions, right? So nobody goes to the next person and be like, what did Rob ask you? And then someone's like, he didn't ask me the same questions. They're the same set of questions for everybody. And one of the questions is like, what would you, if you were in my shoes, what would you be focused on? And depending at the level of the person, like sometimes you'll get some amazing little nuggets, or sometimes you'll get strategic advice. Like, so it varies greatly. Sometimes you get, the person has no advice.
Right.
But you get these little stories, and the other, so that's one piece, right? And then the next piece is I like to use stories, right? And I learned this from, watching, Mike Kelly in action when I was at AOL. Like Mike Kelly, some amazing stories, and they always have some reason for why he's telling them. So by having your own little, toolbox of stories to kind of explain situations, to say, hey, this is why this is important, or why I want you to share this information, it gets people excited, right? So for example, at Eyeview, I met with the integration, one of the technical integration people that integrates the advertisers. He's probably 2 weeks into the job. And I said, what would you focus on? Well, I don't know he's like, I don't know the CEO job, but he said, hey, our integration document we send to customers is like 40 pages long. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, that sounds too long. And he was like, yep, I got it down to 2 pages, and I think I'm going to be able to get it down to 1. Because I look at it as like, you send it to a client, who knows who's getting it to client. They might turn to the wrong page and like, launch a nuclear missile or something really bad. So like you have a bunch of those stories, and you kind of share those, and it gets people to open up. And I think the other general challenge about getting people to share that information is, and I think this happens at venture-backed companies, is you're growing top line like crazy. You're raising more rounds of funding. You keep growing, grow as fast as possible. And this lens in the company becomes all around revenue. And look, revenue's king, let's be clear, because without revenue, you have nothing flowing through the whole stack to pay people. But because there are these huge numbers, like 40% year-over-year growth, 50% year-over-year growth, the little ideas tend to get ignored, right? So either it's like, someone might have this great idea that just makes some process 5% better. We don't have to worry about it because we're growing so quickly. Focus on growth. So part of it is you have to kind of reorient people and say, look, every idea matters. We just have to decide how we prioritize them. And then the other piece too, to that point, is sometimes these things will never make it. When you prioritize a product roadmap, there's the Mendoza line, which essentially is like, when you're below that line, you ain't getting any product or engineering love. That's the other problem, is a lot of stuff falls behind that line, and no one ever thinks about bringing that back up to the line, even though it's critical stuff. So if you think about it, like when you're looking at a product roadmap for a company, there's probably like a pillar of new product development, right? There's tech debt, and really to oversimplify it, existing, and then probably just the tuning, operational excellence, automation. And many times, like, you literally, the only focus is on tech debt, new products, and the existing platform, and that last column is just totally ignored.
Right. And that's, it's interesting, because one of the things that I'll put this to you, I don't know if I apply it to the publisher world, which is of course where I'm focused. You might tell me with your experience, this is not unique, right? But I kind of think of the way that publishers are structured. And I think that structure gets in their way of thinking like true digital companies, right? There's, and almost every decision now is multi-departmental, right? If you think about the traditional silos, and you're going like, oh, wow, this is going to touch data. Well, now legal, marketing, like suddenly everyone gets involved, and suddenly everything kind of comes to a grinding halt, right? And so the one thing that I kind of have always thought about, knowing that that's an issue, is that at some point, I know it's going to rear its ugly head, is spending the time while you can trying to figure out that cross-departmental, whatever that is, to create some kind of glue, so that when it comes time to actually come together, so you do it with a war room on a daily basis, and that makes a lot of sense, right? But there's also just that when everyone leaves the war room, did everyone just leave with their own agenda and what they heard, and off they go, to only come back the next day and go like, wait, I thought we were doing this first, right? So I think that there's those particular pieces. So one, testing my theory with you, is that a publisher, I'm sure other companies have this issue, but like the silo piece of how departments are set up, as being the barrier to moving forward. Do you see that elsewhere?
Yeah, no,
Thoughts on that?
100%. Now it might be a slightly different angle, right? So if you think publisher, you have people that have gone from purely print to digital, and goals and roles aren't aligned, so that also creates a giant kind of cluster,
Yeah.
and a lot of suboptimal interpersonal interactions. But I think, like, if you look at like a tech company, there you have issues where sometimes product won't be talking to, and I'm not specifically talking about Eyeview, but I'm saying just in general, a place I've been at, like, product isn't getting customer requirements, or they're putting something together and never sits down with the operational teams to figure out, like, hey, how do we launch this? Right. So you have those types of things, which then cause things to literally fall over upon launch. So yeah, you see, it's just slightly different, right? In some cases, people just don't know what the right process is.
Just different characters. Yeah. No, I think that's one of the things that I find and always love talking about is the gap between departments and what that costs a company in terms of actually performing on things. Last thing on this part, because I want to start to get into again some of the roadmap, which is, yeah, so you're going and you're interviewing everyone in the company and you're creating this and you're getting all that feedback. Do you have any kind of collection process and or way that you are working through that? Because again, I do this around conferences. Someone will throw one little idea and I'm like, that's not what I need right now.
Sure.
But I do not want to lose it. So how do I collect that and make sure to process everything?
Yeah, so there's two parts. So when I do the general onboarding, I'll put all those notes together and I tell everyone, look, I'm going to aggregate these up. I'm not going to say so-and-so said X, but I'm going to pull the themes out and then meet with the departmental heads to share the themes, get validation there. And then I share it back to the entire organization and get feedback from them. I want them to know that I heard. And look, I might say, look, this is a problem, but let's be fair. I will fix this, but we're not fixing this tomorrow. Like, this is not, like, I'm a big believer in also being very, very direct to say, hey, like, this is important, but it's not that important. We'll do that later. And I think people appreciate that versus having someone say, yeah, we'll work on it. And then, like, nothing ever happens. That's pretty disappointing. But when you're in the process of trying to extract all those ideas, normally you have smaller team meetings with, usually department head, whiteboarding sessions. There's different ways to facilitate that with stickies or a spreadsheet. And it's like literally just, and sometimes you can just kind of force the issue of saying, hey, just come up with the top 3. Like, no one's going to grade. This is not a grading thing. No one's going to get fired if they don't have great ideas, but, like, at least come up with 3 ideas, right? You are CEO of your job. If you had to make a strategic decision of, like, the top 3 things, your wish list, what are they? Right. And then once you have that in, like, Google Doc or whatever, you can then start to sort it, make it thematic. Because the thing is, everyone will say it slightly differently. So, like, you'll see recurring themes. And then you also get that kind of voting process as well, because you see how many times it shows back up again. Yeah. And that gives you an idea of how important it is.
Interesting. Yeah, it might, if time permits, I might circle back on that just in terms of strategies around that. But I think there's some other things I want to kind of move forward, but there's some pieces to that. So then you kind of part 2, you start talking really about kind of the roadmap and kind of the categories around it. And so there are a couple of things. This is where you start the Deichert-isms start to pop up in true form. So automation, just I've heard of that one, right? I've heard of that category. Background radiation revenue. Now, I didn't go to school for business. Going to say first time I've ever heard the term. So Rob, please enlighten me.
Yeah. So I did not learn that in business school. But the concept is, you think about it, like, that if you fly airplanes, you get more radiation than if you just stay on the ground, right? Based on how high up you are in the atmosphere. But the concept is everyone's getting exposed to background radiation right now. If you're downwind of Chernobyl, it's probably far worse than, like, if you're just sitting, like, somewhere in the US at the moment. But the concept is, if you do something, you just make more money and you don't have to sell another customer anything, right? So, like, I love things that I can put on the roadmap and prioritize that just make more money, and I don't have to call a customer or a partner or anyone and say, will you buy some more? Will you turn this on? So examples of that in the RTB space would be, like, getting better match rates, so you can find users and go after them. It could be better optimization algorithms. So now, like, if you have uncapped budgets and your ROI performance improves, like the clients can spend more money. But it's this concept of like, hey, is this something where I'm going to have to spend 6 months upselling a customer on it? Or is this stuff that like literally, now maybe if you just have to call them and say, flip the switch, that I'll still put that in the same category. But it's literally stuff that like a customer would have to be insane to say, no, I don't want that. Or you can just turn it on and they love it anyway. And they may not even know about it, but everyone makes more money. And it could be background radiation margin too, right? So maybe your revenue doesn't change, but you have more margin because you did something that improves that, maybe it's bidding strategies, who knows?
Yeah. So I got it. Right. So, again, and I like, again, the idea that putting people in a position to think about what you have to do without calling the client that is going to essentially generate more revenue or more margin is a pretty cool kind of approach to thinking about understanding your business, about what it takes to make another call, right? If you have to have a business by which you can do that and structure it that way. If you're not thinking that way, you should be, right? In other words, hey, when I'm making you successful, I get paid more is a great way to be configured in that way, so that as you just bring them more business, you reap that benefit. All right, that's an interesting one. One of the things that you have in that kind of statement, or statement in that is like, I always tell my teams something is always broken at all times, and the winners just find and fix it, faster.
Yeah.
Which I think is a good strong quote to think about, especially in our space.
Yeah,
right?
no, I mean, my guess is it probably applies everywhere else, but what I found in ad tech, especially when, because I was at, ed.com back when it was like network and tags, but now in this RTB space where you have like a many to many coming together in a programmatic, computers talking computers fashion, like I think sometimes people just tend to assume because computers are talking to each other, nothing can go wrong, right? And
Yeah.
in the space, like that's probably not a good assumption. So what I explained to people is like, look, I mean, every successful place I've been at is that you should automatically assume that there are broken things, and you should be actively looking for them on a regular basis. Now, does that mean looking for every little itsy bitsy thing? Probably not. But you just have to have that assumption, like stuff could be broken, and if you find it and fix it faster, that usually will make a huge difference. And I think also to that point is it's operational excellence. So I always get very nervous when you have like companies where they're like, okay, we're unsuccessful running this business, or we run it in mediocre fashion, but we're going to go start making electric cars. And I'm like, wait a second, like if you can't execute your core business that generates your revenue and your margin today in an operationally excellent way, you may not have permission. And I'm not sure how successful you're going to be with that innovation pivot. Now, I'm sure there's like 1 out of 100 that make it, but in any case, they don't.
Yeah, that's interesting. You make me think of the old days, and this is again where I think like an ad operations mindset can actually be very helpful, right? And I remember the old days of, again, we saw a traffic spike, right? And one of the websites I worked with long ago was like, let's send out a press release. And I was like, well, I don't actually believe the number. And like, like suddenly you hear that, wah, wah, like I'm like the Debbie Downer of this thing. But at the same time, I'm the one that's looking at the numbers and it doesn't make any sense. So, poke into it and you find, there is a problem here. Thank God we didn't go out with that press release around traffic,
Yes.
back when people did that. I mean, I guess they still do, but there's like maybe 4 companies that do that. But like, everyone else is too small to measure to even get a press release out of it. But there's a part there of like continually questioning the numbers. Is at the end of the day something that sit there and really uncover something about your business that otherwise is just a hidden secret that's going to hit you.
Well, think about it. You have 2 machines talking to each other, and then there are humans controlling both of those machines, some of which work in your company and some of which do not. And how many times do people make mistakes in your company operating the machines?
Right.
It happens. So you also should assume that it happens elsewhere.
So one of the questions that came up, and Azir, by all means, if you want to turn your mic on, or otherwise I'll just start to read this. He says, I think one of the challenges we ran into regarding looking for things to fix is that the scope is so large once you have multiple years of features in a system. Good point. We've been moving towards creating alertings around our data to help us with this, right? So in other words, it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong with this, you start adding features, right? In other words, if you're not operating it optimally the way that you've been talking about, you do have features and you have scope creep and you have all that kind of stuff. Then it
Oh, sure.
becomes even more hard to find where the problems are, right?
Yes.
Right.
But
And like, and towards that, like, you don't know what could be broken, and um, when you're just looking at your top level KPIs, you might not notice that there's a smaller issue hidden underneath the hood. So yeah, we've been trying to get as granular as we can with the data, and therefore create like alerts around, hey, this random little thing suddenly changed. Is this something we need to look into? Is it something we can, to your question, we can question the data once we know there's something to look at.
yeah. So, so you kind of touch on, and Rob, we could probably have a whole separate webinar just on data-driven management and decision-making, but you bring up I'll bring up my thing as the fallacy of alerting systems, right? So I can't tell you how many companies I've worked at where people are like, we're going to build an alerting system that's going to tell us when things are broken. And I'm like, and guess what? Like, for that to actually work, you actually have to know all the things that could break. And to your point, it's very hard to know all the things that are going to break, right? So it's kind of this like circular reference in Excel that like, is going to cause the little beach ball to spin around on your computer. So,
Yeah.
The key thing there is that goes back to those reports, and you have to de-average the reports. Just looking at top line KPIs, you have to say, all right, what is the right level to go down to where we're going to capture 80% of the things that could go wrong. And then also I think when you're designing stuff, like I always push the teams, like, how are we going to monitor to make sure this is actually working? Because I think a lot of times things are built and no one builds in, or a few people build in monitoring in key points of whatever the process is or how the product works to understand, like, how do we know this is working? So if we have to troubleshoot it, explain to me how we're going to troubleshoot it if it doesn't work when we turn it on. And when someone can't explain that to me, I get very nervous.
Yeah, my new, I'm going to try to make this kind of a catchphrase, right? Is just throw some machine learning at it, right? Watch that sucker fly. Just because you're right. Like the alert system can be just as broken as the system it's trying to measure. So it is diving down into that. I think those are some good points.
Yeah.
So going down through your categories that you had in the article, of course, I know hard cost savings. That's a pretty straightforward, and by all means elaborate. But then we hit soft cost savings and your Fubar-Docel. Fubar-Docel. Am I saying it correctly?
Fubar-Docel.
Fubar-Docel. I mean, you created the term, so you get to say how it's pronounced. Okay.
Yes.
Fubar-Docel. Okay. Explain to us what that means.
So Fubar is effed up beyond all recognition, and then boondoggle, is kind of when you go off on some, stupid journey somewhere with like no mission involved, right? So it's basically putting both of those together into one single thing. So you have something that's really, really broken, and it's like a totally terrible mission associated with, or like clearly no mission, and you're just kind of wandering around the desert. That's the gist of putting them together.
Got it.
It goes back to the stuff I learned from Mike. Like, if you can brand certain terms with your teams so that they start to use it as kind of like it becomes a verb or an adjective, like it's a good thing because like it gets people to come together.
Well, we'll see. So, part of my virtual happy hour I have on Fridays, we always identify a term. And so the game is this, right? So I give a term, and you're supposed to the next week work it into a meeting in the appropriate way, but in a way that no one would ever think you would use it, right? So ledger domain, right? Which, sleight of hand, right? You could just say like that company is really shady, or you could just use a really big term and just watch everyone just go, just watch the panic. So maybe I'm not the guy to teach efficiency sometimes, but yes, I like the idea of creating your own term, and I will see if I can make that part of the Beeler.Tech vernacular.
Cool.
But it is, you use it in an area where you are talking about something you already hit on, which were the manual tasks, right? And in terms of, again, the way people are operating without necessarily thinking through, do I really have to do this? How do I get to that kind of next level, and so forth?
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little bit further? The other term on that is, defuckerizing the situation even,
Yep.
even harder. So
Yeah. So we talked about automation, right? And that's like clear, right? Hey, I'm doing I'm trafficker. I'm copying and pasting things between two, like something terribly, should be automated. These are more categories of, it's a process that goes across multiple teams. So a good example is like forecasting, right? So you have a process that can possibly be automated in some instances, but it's also just a poorly designed process, or a process with bad assumptions, right? So I always tell people, like, forecast. If I could forecast accurately in digital media, I would go work on Wall Street, because I could make a lot more money trading stocks. And I can't, so I'm still in ad tech. So if you think about the ad tech space, like, you'll have people that want, sales will say, we need a forecast, it has to be accurate. And it's never accurate, right? A third are too high, a third are too low, and a third are just right. And guess what? You don't know which third is which when you actually hand out the forecast. So, I usually go back to sales, and I'm like, I can give you two forecasts. One that's a stretch forecast, which is a higher probability of me missing it, but the customer is risk loving and it's not a big deal for our customer relationship. Or we will choose the conservative one, where we may leave money on the table, but the customer is risk averse, and that is a better outcome than missing the number. But that's the type of process change where, if that's not working correctly, there's these soft costs that occur, which is the drama going back and forth of sales yelling at forecasting, why is this wrong? People running around with their hair on fire to try to deliver something. Like, it's just, as I said in one of Laura's on the call in her training session for Inside Sales, I'm like, it's like going into McDonald's and ordering a lobster. Like, what do you think is going to happen? Like, it's probably not going to show up. Or if it does, like, who knows, like, the deep dive. So,
yeah, that's you just made me think about like 20 different analogies off of that that could be fun to kind of collect. Yeah, that's the part of, shoot, there's an aspect of it that the other underlying part of the drama behind the scene is watching and listening to salespeople. So the people who are going to be client facing, right? Like, again, you want to arm them with what it takes to go out there. And so, by the way, just as a quick correction, because I think Matthew Katz has got it, which is, I identified ad ops as being Debbie Downers. We're more the realists, right?
right.
Salespeople need they need to be tied to reality, but they're the ones that actually have to go out there in front of someone and say, this is going to be good, right?
Yes.
And that's the part that I always feel like sometimes there's a mistake in terms of how companies are organized, is this, let's talk about all the possible things that could go wrong and how this could blow up after the sale, to then go like, but you know what? That's most likely not going to happen. Go sell it. Or if you hear that salesperson going like, yeah, you got to create that energy and that the process by which is to give it to them ready to go and be like excited about that. And can't have them talking, making stuff up,
Right.
but you got to get them to that point. Because otherwise all of this work leads to a salesperson going like, I really don't want to go in that room. They're thinking, and this is why I've seen this a lot this year. Sorry, I'm on my tangent at this point, right? But, salespeople are thinking past 2020, and they really don't want to burn their Rolodex. Saying contacts just doesn't have the same effect as Rolodex, right? But that idea that like, they can't go out there and just sell crap just to try to help you get through the year. You got to give them something that's going to sit there and go like, they're going to come back. I'm going to have a happy client. And no matter what happens at the end of this, I didn't lose not only my job, but my profession, my career, because I can't ever call on that client again.
Right.
I see that happening with that. So interesting. That was a tangent on a tangent on a tangent.
Sure.
But good stuff, Rob.
Thank you.
So just kind of wrapping up on some of that, and I want to keep an eye on time. One of the things you focus on is the new features and the new products. And maybe this kind of ties somewhat to my tangent, is you need to study the density, as in how many customers does this feature or product apply to?
Yeah.
And I am curious of how you manage that conversation, because there is always the client that pays you X, but is so important because someday they could be worth this.
Hey,
How do you
all my
manage
clients
that?
are
How
the
do you
most
work through
important
that?
clients.
Say that again.
All of my clients are the most important clients.
Okay. So then
So
explain to me density then.
yeah, so the density piece is like, and I've seen this before where, and either it's because your back's up against the wall or you just don't have good discipline, or at least in my opinion, you have good discipline. Is that some client will say, I want this feature or whatever, and I'll spend a ton of money. And my whole concern there is that a lot of times this takes I don't know, 3 months, 6 months. Like maybe it's a quick feature, but let's just assume it's something that actually takes some significant investment of your engineering and product teams. At the end, it's a binary outcome, right? Like most of these things, at least I've seen, it's not like the customer maybe said they'd spend 10 and they only spend 5. It's usually either they spend or they don't spend at all,
Mm-hmm.
right? And now you have this thing you just built, and there's nothing that engineer and product love more than building stuff that never gets sold. They really love that. If you survey all of your engineering departments, they will be like, I love it when we build stuff and it never gets sold and it never gets used. They love it. So what about the density thing is like you got to put in the practice of saying, okay, great. So this cable company wanted X. All right, now let's go to all of our other cable company clients and not say this client asked for X, but say, hey, we're thinking about this new feature. What do you think? And I bet you'll get 5 other things you need to change about that to make it better. And it'll probably even make it more sticky with the original person that had the kernel of the idea to start with. Right. So, and then now you have if it's 5 customers, now there are 5 binary things happening, binary outcomes, which is probably better than just having 1.
Which is interesting when you put that in context of one of the other statements you say, which is kind of avoid product development by committee, which I think what you're, if I compare those 2 things you just said, sound like they might be in conflict. But the idea is that if you're talking about stuff internally, you can wind up causing your own problem because you're anticipating what the client is asking for. Yes. But if you're involving the client in that process, again, your ability to go back and say, I heard you, this is what we're going to do, or this is where it is on the roadmap, you potentially have a sale. Yes. Where internally you're just spinning wheels.
And look, I think to that point too, and this goes to the soft cost savings piece, is as you get bigger and departments are more formalized, right? Because usually that, those things you were talking about usually don't happen at small startups. But once they're bigger, then part of the executive team's job is to make sure that each of the departments has a well-tuned process, right? So a lot of times it kind of it bounces around. Things are not parallel path. You aren't building optionality in the plan. So, when you first come up with something, maybe you should talk to your chief privacy officer, over coffee, and just say, hey, we're thinking of doing this. Is there any third rail type things in the subway where you'll get 10,000 volts if you touch it, right? So you do that first, and then you come up with a process that has that kind of incremental development. And I guarantee you, now it feels like there's more communication going on, but I bet you're going to have a quicker outcome than you would if you kind of do it the traditional kind of waterfall way.
Right. So it's a choose whether you want to herd cats or steer glaciers. Those are my analogies in terms of the pieces of it. So then you start getting, and this is getting into the Rob Deichert psyche a little bit more, because you use the term, and if I mispronounce it, I apologize, but Yubitsumi?
Yes.
Did I say that right? Okay,
I think so.
All right, we'll go with that, because that doesn't happen. So just so you know, I don't say things correctly the first time. So explain to me what that term means, and then of course we'll just all look at you and judge why these things are something known to you. Go ahead.
Yeah. So going back to my colorful stories, right? But the Yakuza is like the Japanese. And I'm not an expert on Yakuza, so please, if someone has better intel, tell me. But then there's they have this tradition called Yubitsumi, where if you screw up, you actually cut off your own finger, part of your own finger, as kind of atonement to your club or gang or whatever, that you messed up. So my point there is that this is a pandemic, right? How far you can see out is radically reduced, right? It's like driving in fog with your high beams on or a heavy snowstorm, right? It like makes it worse when you put on the high beams, it's actually worse, right? Than when you put your low beams. So you got to turn on your low beams. And then once you turn your low beams on, then you've got to really get radically focused with whoever's promising the revenue. Hey, like if we miss this, we're literally starting to cut off pieces of our fingers, right? So it is a constraint-based optimization problem. And guess what? You only have 5 fingers, right? You should have 2 hands, but the question is like, do you use both hands? So that's where when you're like saying, hey, we got to build this new product or we need to do this, like, all right, like really, like we have to really get crystal clear on who's it getting sold to? How long is because I've seen things built and no one realized it's a 6-month sales cycle, right? So they think, oh, we build this, it delivers, and we have all this revenue right away. I'm like, no. You got to go sell this. So this is where you just kind of get laser focused on everyone's got to be as honest and conservative as possible in their projections, because if you miss, off comes part of your finger. Not literally, but like.
I was going to ask for that
hand can be your
clarification.
company. So.
Okay. I was going to ask for that clarification and just,
yes.
I want you to tell me, look me right now and tell me none of the people that have ever worked for you have had to cut off their finger.
None of them have had to cut off their fingers.
Yeah, Alexander, hold your hands up, both of them. You only held up one hand. That's why I was like really kind of nervous with that. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, and again, I love the thought, and again, it's like getting to that crystal clearer. This is how we're operating right now, right? You just can't kind of float by.
And think about it. If you actually if it was either make a mistake or get it right or lose your part of your fingers, like obviously that's not going to really happen, but that's how serious this is. Like we need to make sure we have good numbers and good projections. If it's a little bit off, like let's just say like, hey, it's half of what the number was.
Right. Call for that. And I think that leads kind of to the last thing, and actually in the interest of time, I think we're a good spot. By all means, if anyone has any questions, I'd love to hear what you have. But it really is, okay, you got the right mindset. You've got, you've kind of evaluated a number of ideas. You're starting to kind of do that. But the thing that's always got to be tough on this is prioritization and doing this in kind of real time, making those choices and whatever. Talk about how you think through that process to make sure that you're hitting on all cylinders when you have to.
Sure. So the order matters always, right? And the reality is there's always more stuff on the roadmap than you can do in whatever period of time you're developing based on. And a lot of times these things are all interrelated, right? So things can build on top of each other. So, I remember when we were redoing the roadmap at Eyeview, we had 2 things that had to get built. And if we built the one thing, it wasn't even usable until we built the second thing. And one was slotted for Q2 and the thing that you needed to make the Q2 thing work was slotted for Q3. But if I had the Q3 thing done first, it also unlocked 4 other things. So like you just switch those, right? So the order is really important. And then you have to optimize based on what your constraints are. So if you go back to all those categories I had before for the product roadmap, and you have to put dollars next to them, right? So that if you take your Aerospike instance from 2 down to 1, you're going to save this much, AWS cost. Now, maybe you might not, because maybe you have an upfront guarantee with them and you have to spend the money, a guaranteed capacity or whatever it's called. So you have to also understand, like, hey, is this a true cost savings or is it kind of funny money, or we actually can't realize it? Because if that's the case, sure, I would love $100,000 in savings on a monthly basis, but it's not going to really show up. So maybe I should do this soft cost thing first, or this background radiation piece first. So part of it is getting actual dollar values in each one of those on the roadmap and by those categories, because then you can kind of start to look and say, okay, well, wait a second, like, this thing has a high probability of either success or failure, or a low probability. It's, expected value it's an expected value issue. But you have this thing that if I fix this, it's guaranteed money in my pocket. And if you are trying to stop your cash burn, then maybe that's what you want to do first, right? So part of it is also, what is your situation as a company? Are you still focused on top line growth? Is margin more important? Is cash conservation? Like all those types of things you have to factor in when you set that order. But one other thing I'll say is really, really important, and going back to that Mendoza line thing earlier, most companies are like stools, right? And if all you do is focus on one leg of the stool and keep adding features and functionality, like the stool becomes unstable and someone falls over. So part of this is like, I think it's really critical to kind of, every segment gets a little bit of love every time, because that will also, get people, because everyone's going to, every department that has a wish list, their most important thing goes first. We're never getting to the bottom of the list of any department. But if you don't spread it around, I mean, there's morale issue, there's all types of other like soft cost things that come up. But the reality is, I bet you the organization will operate better than you ever thought, just because you kind of are starting to fix those things across the company.
Very cool. I realized I should have prepped you with this question. It's kind of the last question. It's not a trick question. It's just one of those like thought things, which is, when you put together content like you did, and thanks for sharing it and putting it out there, right? I mean, again, I think that creates these kind of conversations that we have to have. I'm sure there's a concept or something that kind of fell on the cutting room floor, or there's just something else that you'd like rather elaborate, whether we covered it now or not. Anything that you didn't get to yet, or anything else that you're thinking about in terms of like maybe your next articles or the next thing that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? Because all these things I think are quasi interrelated, and there's overlap, but definitely like data-driven management and like how do you do that, and attention to detail, I think is important. I think there's also, I definitely have opinions on the ad tech tax and how people think about that.
I hear myself starting to already count the number of other sessions that we need to do on this, because I think this is great. Yeah, just on the data-driven thing, one of the concepts, I threw it out in a meeting as a comment, and I wrote it down, and I'm going to be writing on this one, which is when companies use reports as a security blanket, right? It's almost like, and it goes almost like to the alert thing, right? Where it's like, well, I just need a report so I can see how the business is running. And it's like, you're wanting a report, but you're not like, it's just like this part of like, yeah, but I got a report.
Yeah.
I need the report. I can tell you what's going on, but no, I want that report. And that makes that feel like there's you're being a data-driven company when you're not. And that's the part.
Hey, let's get Looker, let's get Meta Markets, let's get Tableau, and magically we're going to be data-driven, and you do things. And the devil's in the details of making these reports, but also the human behavior change that's associated with it to actually leverage them, right? Because you can send these things out and nobody looks at them. So there's a real ownership thing. I think there's a longer conversation definitely around that piece.
I'd love to have that, because as someone who always winds up being the one who has to create the reports that I know aren't getting read, but somehow just if it's not in there, again, it's like right out of that movie Office Space. It's like,
well, and the other thing I was thinking of, which going back to New Orleans thing, because I presented the New Orleans conference, and I think it was about ad ops and excellence. So if we can find that deck, we should bring it back and see how much of that stuff is still true today. That might be a fun episode. I remember there's a picture of like people making sausage in a sausage factory, and I was, one of the things like keep the customer out of the sausage factory. They don't like to see it being made. They just like to eat it cooked, and it tastes good. So
I will say this as a thought on that, is I've gone back to look at the very first Ad Monsters and saw what the topics were for discussion. And part of it was because when we're hitting like our 50th pub forum and these other little celebratory things, like, look how far we've come. And you're like, hate to break to everybody, but we're still talking about how to work with sales, reporting, operate, all these things. So we got a ways to go. So Robert, thank you so much for this, and a great conversation. And thanks everyone for giving us an hour of your time. And thanks for all the comments and questions and things like that. Good stuff. I got a feeling we're gonna do this again.
And Rob, you're gonna record this and post it, right? So
it is being recorded, and I'll post it. Make sure we'll put it on YouTube, as well as I'll have it on Beeler.Tech for people to look at as well.
Excellent.
All right.
Well, thanks everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Stay safe. Bye.
Bye.